is not inevitable. It is a choice.
Most great powers we know today have been built on wars. So, of course, war does pay.
This is Open to Debate. I'm John Donvan. Hi, everybody. Our topic today for debate is war. Is there ever a time when there is not one going on somewhere? Right now, just to name the most ferocious, there is Ukraine, there is Gaza, there is Sudan. And you go back in time, way back, and how many of the great literary works of antiquity are actually about war or warriors? The Iliad, Beowulf, so many more. And it raises the question of why. Why is there so much war? Is it just baked into how we tend to arrange ourselves as humans into tribes and nowadays into states? Or is there, and has there always been, a route to avoiding war? In this episode, we're going to look at the global system of power and states as they exist today. And we're asking this question with powerful arguments on both sides. Is war inevitable? Let's meet our debaters. Answering that argument, the answer to that question is yes, that war is inevitable. I want to welcome Dylan Motin. Dylan is visiting scholar at Seoul National University Asia Center, where he focuses on the study of international relations, balance of power theory, and great power competition. He is the author of a lot of books on this topic, including Territorial Expansion and Great Power Behavior During the Cold War, also How Louis XIV Survived His Hegemonic Bid. Dylan, welcome to Open to Debate. It's so great to have you.
Thanks a lot, John.
And to answer no to the question, is war inevitable? I'm delighted to welcome Gabrielle Rifkind, who is a conflict mediator with a background in group psychology and geopolitics. She is founder and director of Oxford Process. That is an independent media organization that works with groups in armed conflict to try to prevent escalation and to try to create peace. She is also author of the forthcoming book, How to Agree to Disagree, From Conflict to Connection, and that comes out in May of 2026. Gabrielle, welcome to the program. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
So sometimes before we start our program, I like to ask our debater what the stakes are for each of them in taking part in this conversation, why they feel they want to actually come and make their argument and their personal connection to the topic. Today, I feel with a topic such as war, and especially given the major armed conflicts we're seeing around the world at the moment, as I described, it almost feels obvious what the stakes are. Arguably, they could not be higher for you or anyone. Dylan, you happen to be a French citizen who is living in South Korea. Korea has been under threat of nuclear war for decades now to varying degrees. I'm just curious, this is a personal question. Is this something you're thinking about in your everyday work, how close you are to that potential conflict?
Of course. I'm really involved here in South Korea for thinking about defense issues because the future of the peninsula has never been so dark, unfortunately. So yes, I do think about that on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's a reality for you is what it sounds like. And Gabrielle, most of your work has been focusing over the years on the Middle East and more recently Russia and Ukraine. And you've had something of a non-traditional career path. I would love to hear just very briefly about the moment you realized that your background in psychotherapy and psychology could be channeled into conflict mediation in such a high-stakes way.
Yes, because I think conflict is not just about power and geopolitics. It's also about people. And it's about humiliation, marginalization, people not feeling they have a stake in what's going on. And it seemed to me that we profoundly missed the ability both to prevent and end conflict early by not understanding more about states of mind, why people behave in this way.
Okay, I'm going to jump in just because I think you're getting into your opening a little bit. So let's get launched. Let's get to our opening statements. I want to give each of you a few minutes to explain why you're answering yes or no to our question. Dylan, you're up first, and you are arguing that yes, war is inevitable. Please tell us why.
Thank you. I just want to try to explain why war keeps happening again and again and again, just by combining three very simple ideas about how the world works. So my first idea here is that states or countries are the main actors in the world. So there is no higher authority, there is no world police or no world government to protect them or to govern them. It's what scholars like to call anarchy. So anarchy doesn't mean chaos or mayhem. It just means that you don't have a safe order for states. The second key idea to keep in mind has to do with intentions. No states can ever be certain of the intentions of other states. Intentions are incredibly hard to figure out because they are in your head, and nobody can know for sure what is in your head. And worse, it's even impossible to know what will be the intentions of state in the future, because you have no way of knowing who will be the leader of Russia, or of China, or the US in 10 or 20 years down the road. So what you can know to an extent is capabilities. You could observe how many troops or tanks does Russia have, but you may never know what is in Russia's leader's mind. So the key point here is that you can never know that another state doesn't have bad intentions toward you. The third key idea is that states, like people or animals to an extent, want to survive. And the reason is obvious. If you don't survive, you cannot accomplish any other goal, isn't it? So states want to survive, absolutely. That's a constant in history. So you take these three ideas, you mix them up, and you end up with a very competitive and very nasty world. Why is that? First, states fear each other because if you meet a state more powerful than you and which has aggressive intentions, you are in big troubles. And in an anarchic system, it means that you have no higher authority you can rely on, you can call if you are under attack or if you are threatened. So that's why fear is constant. And second, you get a self-help world. So it's a world where states fear each other and they understand that they have to take care of themselves because nobody will do the job for them. So in such a world, you cannot know the intentions of other states, and other states may be more powerful than you. So the best way to survive is yourself to be most powerful, to be the biggest dog in the district, so to speak. So you want to maximize your power. And that's where the story of war comes in. In such a world, you have an intrinsic interest to sometimes start wars in order to gain or to secure your power. In that sense, unfortunately, but sometimes war can be an efficient tool of statecraft. And the sad thing is that in international politics, violence often pays. So in a self-help system, you have a strong incentive to take land or to grab resources from others to reinforce yourself and put enemies down. That's the explanation of war, of the deep causes of war that political scientists like to call realism. And I believe that's why war happens and will keep happening for the foreseeable future.
Thank you very much, Dylan, for your opening. Gabrielle, you disagree. You believe war is not inevitable. You have 4 minutes, please, to make your case.
Yes, I think I have to respond to Dylan to begin with, because states do not decide war, individuals, humans decide war. Now, my argument is that war is not inevitable. I'm not a pacifist, but history shows war fails. We only need to look at Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, so-called war on terror. None of these wars bring peace. Each leave greater chaos, insecurity, and human misery. Yet, what we see is a new arms race, the collapse of cooperation, a worldview that treats peace as fragile. In Beijing, we see nuclear warheads parade past as President Xi speaks of win-win cooperation. But the missiles tell another story. In Europe, Ukraine is suffering the bloodiest war since 1945. And in Washington, Donald Trump has subtitled the Department of Defense the Department of War. But where is the Department of Peace? The US now spends 200 times more on the military than on peace building, mediation, and conflict resolution. For generations, the strategy has been guided by one maxim: if you want peace, prepare for war. But what if this logic is wrong? What if, by preparing for war, it makes war more likely? As Chekhov warned us, if a pistol hangs on the wall in the first act, it will be surely used in the second. My fellow debater, Dylan, is a realist scholar of international relations whose intellectual lineage is Hobbes and Machiavelli. I do share some sympathy for realism, and we don't need to be naive about human behaviour. But we're both capable of kindness and cruelty. Kissinger was smart when he opened the door of diplomacy to China, as was Reagan, and he made rapprochements with the Soviet Union. But we need not to think about geopolitics and power, but also humans and the consequences of war. Realism overlooked the human cost. War kills millions and leaves scars and generations of violence. Up to 25 million people were killed in the Russian Second World War, and this has set up the belief that it's the only way to protect yourself. Robert McNamara was the architect of the Vietnam War and author of Fog of Peace, when 1 million people died during his time in government. He later said, "We failed because we didn't understand the mind of the enemy." I have the same lesson in my book, Fog of Peace, How to Prevent War. To prevent war, we have to learn to get into the mind of the enemy, to understand how they're thinking, why they fight, and we have to learn to manage our radical differences. So let's be clear, war is not destiny, it's not inevitable, it is a choice. And if we truly want to prepare for peace, we better stop preparing for war.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. We're now going to move into the discussion portion of the program. But before we do, I just want to quickly summarize what I think I heard from both of you. Neither of you likes war. Neither of you is pro-war. So there's no argument that war is good in any way. We're talking a different question. Is it inevitable? Dylan Motin makes the argument that the reasons that wars keep happening stems from the fact that that's just how the world is set up and how it works, that there is no central authority, no single polar power that's keeping order. Therefore, the states are left there to fend for themselves. And in fending for themselves, they live in what he described as a nasty and competitive world where fear is a constant, where nations need to rely on themselves. He described it as self-help. And that, as I think he used the word unfortunately, the way that they can establish their own security is by being the most powerful. And sometimes that requires literally starting wars, grabbing land in order to establish themselves as the most powerful. So again, he's not making a defense of war, but making an argument that it can't be avoided. Gabrielle Rifkind disagrees, arguing, first of all, she says that there is a human element, that there are decision makers in the process, while making it clear that she is not a pacifist. She cites the many ways in which war has done the opposite of bringing peace, which I think equates to the notion of security that Dylan was talking about, to be able to live in a state of security and non-war. That generally speaking, wars, very often rather, wars frequently backfire. They bring more conflict, more resolution. She refutes the notion that if you want peace, you should prepare for war. She says that the opposite is true. And her bottom line is that war is not inevitable. War is a choice. I hope that both of you feel that I've captured your argument as we continue the discussion. Dylan, I want to take on that last point of Gabrielle's, that war is a choice. That question, that statement contains a lot, but how do you react to that thought?
Of course, Gabrielle is right that at the end of the day, it's human beings pulling the triggers. There's no doubt about that. And I personally believe that human beings deep down are social animals, which when individuals meet each other, they usually are benevolent and have good intents toward each other. But the issue is that when you put these individuals in a government office and you start calling them states, they behave in a very different way, because you're not dealing anymore with individuals living their daily life. You are dealing with institutions which have to take decisions, strategic decisions, for the safety of their country and safety of their people. So I don't dispute the argument of that leaders matter to an extent, but we are talking about groups of people who have to think strategically, and that's why you don't have much of a choice on the menu. Like, if you go to the pizzeria and ask for Chinese food, you're going to have an issue because you don't have that many choices of menu. The same goes for states. When you are in a situation where you may lose power, you may decline relative to potentially threatening states, you don't have much options on the menu. You have to choose between fighting your way out of this or accepting decline and accepting maybe that you may fall victim of the other side because you have no idea what this other side has in mind. So that's why I'm making the argument that yes, leaders can matter, but structurally speaking, the international system pushes state toward power competition and sometimes toward war. That's the point I was making.
Gabrielle?
Well, I think there's a lot there. I think there is more on the menu than you suggest, Dylan. And I think your point about countries not knowing what's in the mind of the enemy, that's exactly the work we need to do. And that is the work of Oxford Process and what we do. We have to get into the mind of the other. We have to set up back channels and understanding what's in their mind and why they're behaving in a particular way. What are their interests? What are their sacred values? What are the things they care about? What are their security interests? So I think just for us to imagine and give and not engage, we're sure to march on a path to war. I could give the example of Russia, who invaded Ukraine first in 2014, and then later it breached Ukraine's sovereignty. But Putin signaled as early as 2008. He said, if NATO expands itself, this is a realist argument, to the border of our country, we are risking going to war. France and Germany agreed with that. I think if we imagine, if the same happened in the US, and there were hostile troops on the borders of Mexico and Canada, it is likely we would be marching to war. So let's address the security interests of the other country. Let's understand what they care about. But why we find it so difficult is we utterly, which is quite understandable, prioritize our own values, our own system, without the capacity to get into the mind of the other.
Dylan, do you want to respond to that?
Yes. You're absolutely right that if you get into the mind of the other, you can lessen the risk that you will make a mistake. So you may reduce the chance of going to war. That's absolutely true. And that's why, for instance, during the Cold War, there was these many thousands of analysts doing Sovietology and working day and night trying to understand, like, on official pictures of the Soviet Union, who was there and not there, to guess what the Soviet Union would do next. So yes, you're right on this point, but what you dismiss from your discussion is that states sometimes have fundamentally different interests. And even if you know what the other side has in mind, you have a distinct interest into opposing this other side. You mentioned the case of Russia. And you're absolutely right that the Russians are deeply scared of the expansion of NATO eastward. And if the Russians were putting troops in Canada, of course the US would be going to war and destroying Canada to a crisp. But the difference here is that the US has a deep-seated interest into pushing east, and Russia has a deep-seated interest into pushing west. And even if you understand this, there is no way to to have Putin and US leaders and the Ukrainians to agree on that, even if they understand each other. So how would you answer to that? How do you answer to the idea that sometimes the interests are so fundamentally hostile and different that you cannot just put them around the table and just have peace like this?
First of all, you talked about all these people in the US imagining the Russian mind. Well, I don't think we can speculate. We can only do it through relationships. Because when we imagine what's in someone else's mind, we usually fail and we mess up. So we have to talk to those who were in disagreement. And I agree. People have interests and radically different interests that you sit around the table and you'll not end up in agreement. That's why I've written this book, Let's Agree to Disagree, because I think the danger is we want to pull people over the barricade and to think like us, and we're not going to. We've come from different systems. You've got democracy, you've got autocracies, you've got people with different histories, different traumas, and different ways of evolving. But we need to be better at respecting and managing these differences and these different interests. But the point is, war seldom resolves these differences. What you actually see is you just set up for yet another round of war. I don't know if we're planning to come on to Palestine, Israel, but military solutions is not going to make it safer for anybody in the end.
I would like to come. I would, Gabrielle, like to come to Palestine and Israel in a little bit, but I want to jump in as I think what I hear. What you just said, the war doesn't lead to peace, is I want to come back to kind of a fundamental question that may explain why nations so often go to war. Does war work? And does war work? Does it meet its goals? Dylan, can you take that question on first? You pointed out in your opening that states are incentivized to show their power in order to send the message to everybody else, do not mess with us. And I think your argument is war does work in that regard. So more fundamentally, the question, does war work? And then I want to bring that back to Gabrielle, same question.
Well, I believe that all three of us are testament to that, because we all three of us live in countries which have been terribly successful at winning wars and growing their territory to the extent that today they are relatively safe and wealthy. Just to take the example of the United States, that's terrible to say, but the US expanded and became such a large country and the great power it is today through a long series of war and marching westward. And the idea that war do not pay, I understand it on a philosophical level or moral level, but for the US it paid awesomely. And think of other cases in history. Most great powers we know today have been built on wars. And this argument that war only recurs time and time again, once again, look at the US today or look at France today, the country I came from. All the small states that were here before, nobody knows about them anymore because they have been absorbed and annexed by France. So, of course, war does pay. And that's, once again, I'm not happy about that. That's terrible to say. But going into other people's lands and conquering them oftentimes works because all the countries in the world today are all built on that.
Gabrielle?
I think your argument might say war did work. And maybe the most successful war was World War II. But since then, the nature of war has radically changed. A lot of wars are civil wars, they're asymmetrical wars, and we have little success and in defeating the enemy and making a safer world. And if you look at the 21st century, and I'll enlarge on my points, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Libya, the war in Iraq, we did not make the world safer. We created more chaos and misery, and we did not make things safer for us. In fact, we got an absolute influx of migration because of the war. And we don't look at the responsibility as to how we've created things. there's now very few examples of war winning. Even if the Russian Federation takes Ukrainian lands, which, you could say, well, that's a victory. It's a very very invidious victory, but it's there are other ways that we could have sat round the table and we could have addressed the security needs of all sides.
Gabrielle, don't we have a structure that has that goal called the United Nations, which was founded after the Second World War, to be the very thing you're talking about, to be a vehicle and a forum and a mechanism for making war not inevitable, making it avoidable. And its track record is quite mixed in that regard. We have a United Nations, we have wars going on right now. So it would seem to me that fact plays more to Dylan's point, that we have the thing that you're asking for, and yet wars are going on. What's your response to that?
I'm not sure I was asking for institutions to help resolve wars. It's people, it's relationships. It involves, who sat down with Putin early on. People who have power and influence, or you can start off with just opening the door, understanding why people are going to behave in a particular way. I think institutions cannot solve wars. Yes, we do have a massive problem with the UN at the moment, and it was established to prevent wars for the future. So I think we have to think again how we're more effective. And part of this is talking to people we don't like, talking to what we might call the bad guys. But we actually have to understand, why are they behaving in this way? What do they stand for? Are they fighting for their own autonomy, their own independence? It's like Robert McNamara said, the problem was we didn't understand the enemy. We were fighting different wars. They were fighting the war of independence. We were fighting the Cold War. Well, that is massive when you get millions of people dying. Maybe if we were sincere about understanding the mind of the other, and we might not like what they might stand for, or certainly not even agree, but it can also be a means of avoiding war. And I think passing motions in the UN is not going to prevent war. In fact, what it is going to do, what you need to do is engage, and you need to sit down, and you need to understand why people are thinking in a particular way.
So let's examine, as you had mentioned before, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and bring this back to you, Dylan. Is what's going on now for you evidence that war is inevitable? Is that a situation where the conflict is inevitable, and if so, what elements make that inevitable? And then I'd like to hear how Gabrielle would respond to that.
To an extent, you could say yes, because I think that it is very clear that in the mind of the Israeli leadership, Israel can achieve the goal of destroying totally Gaza and annexing, and now they are talking in these words, not mine, annexing Gaza to the Israeli state. So the simple fact that the Israeli believe that this is possible and this is okay, I think it tells you anything you need to know on the issue of war today. Political leaders all around the world keep believing that they can enter other people's land and annex them, and it's going to be okay. Because as I was mentioning earlier, in an anarchic system where you don't have a world police, you don't have a world 911 to call, states are free to try to invade others and to destroy everything and to seize everything. But was the same for the Russians. The Russians believed they had a shot at conquering Ukraine, and they tried. And they almost went there, but they messed up very badly, and now they are engaged into this a very long war of attrition, but they still believe they can win, and they still believe they can get away with a big chunk of Ukraine. So yes, all these conflicts and Israel.
But is there inevitability in that conflict in the fact that Hamas, that currently was in control of Gaza, is dedicated to the destruction of Israel? Is that an irreconcilable, unavoidable conflict of which in itself makes conflict inevitable?
Are you talking to me?
No, I'm taking it to Dylan, and then I want to bring it back to you, Gabrielle.
I wasn't making the case that this specific conflict is unescapable.
You're not making that case.
Yes, I was making the case that it shows you that war in general remains possible, but I wasn't making the case that this war is unstoppable.
Okay.
I think it wasn't.
Okay, let's bring it to Gabrielle then.
What question do you want me to answer?
Well, was conflict between Hamas and Israel inevitable?
I don't think it's ever inevitable. I actually spent a lot of time sitting with and talking to Hamas for about a decade. I think, I'm not sure you could be talking to the military wing, and I think we could talk about how that came about. You say it's because it wants to destroy Israel. It's a lot more complicated than that. And I think what we cannot deny in this conflict is about the history of trauma, the levels of disturbance on both sides because of the use of violence. It is the use of violence that has made it so difficult to resolve this war. In fact, one of the things Hamas used to talk about was a long-term hudna, paradoxically, a period of up to 20 years without violence. And it is only without violence that people can actually work out how to live together. Now, as a result of my work sitting with Hamas, and I'm not an advocate of it, it's a very, very complicated story. But in 2006, when the Hamas government came to power, Ismail Haniyeh sent a message and via me to say to the Israeli government they want to start passing goods over the border. They wanted to begin to think very slowly how they were going to exist without violence. Now, the Israelis, because of the Second Intifada and the suicide bombing campaign, were so disturbed by that, it was impossible to imagine engaging with Hamas. So what you see is how the history of violence and trauma makes peacemaking so difficult.
So where do you intervene in a process that continues to unfold like that and continues to have, this yin-yang process that continues where the violence becomes a cycle? In your best hopes, where do you intervene in this process to avoid further conflict in the way that you say is possible?
Well, I think you have to think, and it's very hard at the height of war. I'm not saying it's this moment it's possible. But first of all, you have to engage with what people think, why they think, whether you like it or not. And you're always thinking about how do you end the violence? What will this require? I think, in fact, in the end, Palestine-Israel, it will look like some kind of regional peace. But we cannot underestimate the history of violence in this very small country with too much history and not enough geography and two people for one land. But we still have to engage and think, begin to imagine how these people are going to live together, or are we going to have just endless war with its consequences and Israel becoming more like a state that's sort of barricaded in? We have to engage and talk about what can all sides live with in a completely realistic, maybe realism manner.
Dylan, your response to that?
I would argue that you're in a situation where Israel clearly wants to get rid of Palestine. It wants to annex Gaza. It also seems to want to annex the West Bank. And Hamas in Gaza for sure doesn't like Israel that much and would also like Israel to be gone. But the only way you could solve this conflict is to have someone extremely powerful jumping in and imposing a kind of a two-state solutions. And this someone very powerful with a lot of leverage is in the US, is in Washington. And as long as you don't have a peace effort, in the US to bring to enforce this kind of solution, you're not going to have peace, and the Israeli will try, I guess, to annex Gaza to the end. So I don't see any good issue right now.
This conflict is not just about power. It is about the traumatic impact, and there are multiple voices in Israel, and not everybody wants to annex Gaza and the West Bank. This government in power might speak that language, but actually, in the end, I think it's a consequence of the violence that is so difficult to find a political solution.
Now we're going to bring in some other voices, some subject matter experts, people who know this topic, have been thinking or writing about this topic, and who also have been listening to the conversation so far. And we invite them to come in and ask a question of our debaters. I'd like to bring in John Horgan. John is a writer with works appearing in publications like the New York Times, National Geographic, the Wall Street Journal. He's the author of a book called The End of Science and the End of War. John, welcome to the program, and please come on in with your question.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. So I want to bring up a big topic related to war, and it's capitalism. So I have some peace activist friends who say that capitalism provides an incentive for war, that they're defense contractors that try to make money off war and even encourage war so they can increase their profits. It seems to me that capitalism can also be a pacifying force by promoting commerce between nations. So I wonder if either guest can comment on how capitalism relates to modern warfare.
Very interesting question. I'd like to have both of our guests respond to that, and I'll start with you first, Dylan.
Sure. Very nice question, but the short answer is that capitalism doesn't matter much in both ways. It doesn't make things a lot worse, but doesn't make them better either. Why is that? In the historical records, when you look at archives and what decision makers have in mind when they started wars, you never see the influence of military lobbies, like defense lobbies. You never see industrials walking in the room and convincing people to start wars. At least I have no knowledge of a major war started by the influence of industries. So I don't believe that defense industries matter very much into starting wars. And also, actually, the defense industry, in the way we mean this today, the military-industrial complex, is very new. It appeared during the mid-19th century. Before that, it didn't exist, and still you had thousands of war in history. So I don't believe that defense industries are the culprit over here. And the other way around, just to take a very big example that we all know, before World War I, you had something called the first globalization. So this era of increased trade and commerce all over the globe, and then this massive war. Again, before World War II, world exchanges were again taking up, and world trade and finance was globalizing, and another war. And then after 1945, people were saying, oh, this time it's World War III coming between the Soviets and the US. And there was no war, and still there was no trade almost between the US and the Soviet Union. You can see that even in these World War things, like capitalism or trade didn't matter a lot. So no, I don't think capitalism matters a lot.
You're saying it's a wash. I want to see what Gabrielle has to say.
I think it's an important question because paradoxically, and even in the Palestine-Israel conflict, it's businessmen who get together, who actually form relationships and have a vision how to end war. And they're much more pragmatic in their relationships and much less ideological. But I don't think you can underestimate the importance of the industrial military complex because it makes us think in a particular way. And, and if one side has a lot more military power than the other, then it is more at risk of using it in a way that is extremely disturbing to the other side. You see that asymmetry in the Palestine-Israel conflict. So I don't think we can underestimate the power of the weapons that are available and how it affects our mindset and how we think about resolving war. Look, let me reiterate, the US invests 1,500 times more on the military than on mediation, conflict resolution and peacemaking.
Yes, I think Gabrielle was mixing two different things. Yes, if you have military power, you have a greater likelihood to want to use it. That's for sure. But that's because of political decision made by states. It's not the defense industries who just give weapons for free. It's states who acquire these weapons and decide to use them. So coming to my point, the issue is political here. The weapon industry is just making weapons on orders. Like you order a pizza and you're not hungry because the pizzeria is selling you a pizza. It's because you're hungry that you're buying a pizza. The same goes for weapons. It's because you are thinking about war that you are buying weapons, not the other way around. The weapons don't make the war. You are the one making the war, so you buy the weapons.
John, and could you in 30 seconds tell us your take on this question about whether capitalism is an enhancer of the danger or a mitigator of the danger of war?
Well, I'm not a pacifist either, but I think war is bad and that we have to get rid of it once and for all. I wrote a book about that called The End of War. So I consider the role of capitalism, and through nothing but wishful thinking, perhaps, I have expressed the hope that the giant corporations, Google and Amazon and Facebook and those, I guess even Tesla, would see war as an impediment to making a lot of money and would become a positive force in the peace movement. It hasn't happened, and now AI innovation is, I think, making war more likely in the future.
Okay, John, I have to break in because of time, but thank you very much for bringing a really interesting question to the conversation. We really appreciate it. Now I'd like to welcome in Valentina Popp, who is news editor at Financial Times. She covers European Union politics, NATO, and Europe's role in preventing and litigating global conflicts. Valentina, thanks so much for joining us on the program. And what question do you have for our debaters today?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I wanted to mention that, to pick up on a point that Gabrielle mentioned about the nature of war changing, even though one might argue that Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was rather traditional. But with all these recent instances of Russia provoking NATO members with drones and fighter jets, breaching Allied airspace, what is your view on hybrid warfare, and how do you see Europe's response so far?
Gabrielle?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm honest, I won't claim to be a specialist in this, but the point I would make is, 3 years on, everybody's been trying out their weapons, becoming much, much more sophisticated in the use of drones and the amount of destruction that it can do, and all the dangers of that if we go along this trajectory. My view would have been that we could have intervened earlier to prevent this war, much, much earlier. And in fact, when the war began, we tried to do a back channel to Putin because we were asked to do it by the Russians because they'd panicked, and we got a European leader to act as a bridge. But there was not the ripeness, the readiness, because of the behavior of the Russian Federation, which, of course, breach sovereignty of another country was totally unacceptable. But in the end, the moral question is, how do you end the war early so we don't become so sophisticated in the use of all these weapons that we're using?
Dylan?
Yes, so I think you were referring about these recent incidents about Russian aircraft entering NATO states' airspace. I'm
Poland in particular. I just want to, for listeners, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I'm extremely worried about that because you have the chance of a miscalculation here. But the only way to move forward in that situation is for NATO to maintain a kind of a very strong posture on its eastern border, to make sure that the Russians don't want to try something funny in the Baltic states or in Poland. And the other way around, for NATO, or the global West, if you want to call it this way, to accept that Russia is not going to let Belarus or Ukraine or Moldova move west without fighting to the very end. So I do think the best option here is a kind of division of Europe between NATO states and the former Soviet bloc with a very strong military deterrent border in the middle, to make sure that each side remain in its corner of the world, and especially Russia doesn't try to invade NATO's lands, if that makes sense.
Can I just add here? I think, 3 years into this war, everything has become much, much more dangerous. And the risks of escalation in nuclear war, Third World War, because we know, as Kissinger said, we know how to go to war and we don't know how to exit. And we don't put in place early means of stopping or preventing war. And I'm not saying that we can always succeed, but a particular mindset as we militarize more and more makes the world more and more dangerous.
Valentina, thank you very much for that question, which got us to a really interesting place. Our last question is coming from Richard Sakwa. Richard is an emeritus professor at the University of Kent and an honorary professor of political science at Moscow State. He is author of The Culture of the Second Cold War. Richard, thanks for joining us on the program. Thanks for listening in. And we'd love to hear your question.
I would like to focus a bit more on the conceptual issue. It's been a fascinating discussion so far, but we need to be a little bit more specific, that we live in a world created in 1945. You mentioned the establishment of the United Nations, but it also established an international system based on sovereign internationalism. At the same time, during the Cold War, the West established what I call the political West, Atlantic Alliance system. Gabrielle mentioned NATO enlargement. It wasn't just Putin in 2008 in Bucharest. It's all the way back to Gorbachev. It was all the way back to Yeltsin. This was a consistent Russian position, which its security concerns were simply not taken into account by an expanding political West. You need to distinguish between NATO and European Union enlargement as well. So my question is, how can we, and indeed you just brought in the question of the nuclear weapons, which I think is fundamentally important. So to what degree are nuclear weapons still valid as a form of deterrence? Because clearly this is failing. And second, we need to shift how can we shift the conceptual paradigm away from, in a sense, more abstract questions and specifically arguing that the Atlantic power system was moving east. Russia then was for 40 years condemning it. Are we responsible for this dreadful war on the eastern end of my European continent?
Dylan, I'd like to, I think I have a sense that Gabrielle is very sympathetic to the point you're making, so I might be wrong about that, but I'd like to go to Dylan first.
Not necessarily, no. I do believe that the war in Ukraine, of this general conflict between NATO and Russia is, in a sense, a tragedy, because every player on the scene is playing his own part very well, which leads to this unending conflict. What do I mean by that? If you are NATO, and if you have this experience during the Cold War of living under the threat of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, and you are very worried about the return of Russian power, you have an incentive to move your border eastward and to try to push Russia as far away as you can. And the other way around, if you are Russia, and you have this very nasty experience of being invaded by Western countries and being threatened all the way around, you have a very strong incentive to rebuild a glacis, a buffer zone between you and the West, and to push as far westward as you can. And if you're a small country like Ukraine also, you don't want to live into the shadow of a great power like Russia. You want to be as strong as you can, and what you do is to go to the West. So everyone playing this part very well lead to this terrible conflict. And I believe that, once again, we have a fundamental difference in interest which cannot be solved easily. So the best way is to go back to the Cold War recipe, to have two strong blocks and with formidable deterrent to make sure that the other one doesn't try something stupid, and to maintain this kind of line for as far as you can, because it is the best option for peace.
Gabrielle.
I thought both of you were making arguments on my side why a war does not have to be inevitable. Certainly the recognition of the dangers of nuclear weapons, it was always argued as a deterrent, and the most extraordinary amount of resources have gone into it. But, that has escalated very, very seriously in the Ukraine-Russia war. With serious threats there. I do not say that we should be moving towards blocks and that people you're for and people you're against and people who agree with you and forming these kind of alliances. I think that's very, very dangerous. I think we have to engage with countries who think differently to us. We have to understand the Chinese mindset. We have to understand the Russian mindset, even if we don't agree. The point is, how can we manage our differences without huge military build-ups? And how do we get into the minds of the other side and come to very difficult compromises? Not compromises that just reflect our interests, but also reflect the security interests of the other side. I mean, I feel that's what was embedded in the question, that Western world thought because we have the better value systems, we have the right to try and encourage and impose it. And those who don't agree with us actually feel threatened. So within that, how do you address the security concerns of all sides, whether we agree with people or not, and not move into blocks, because blocks means isolation and more paranoia.
Okay, I have to jump in because of time, Gabrielle. I apologize. And Richard, thank you very much. It was very helpful, your question, to get specific. We really appreciate it. Now it's time to bring this conversation and debate home with our closing remarks. Dylan, you're up first. The floor is yours for the next 2 minutes to tell us one more time why you believe war is inevitable.
Thank you. As a final word, I invite the listeners to search on the internet for 2 prehistoric cave paintings. So the first one is a battle scene from Ceuta in Algeria, and the second one is another battle scene from Les Dogues in Spain. So both date from around 5000 BC, it's a long time ago, and both portray an armed conflict between 2 groups fighting with bows and arrows. And it's perhaps the oldest artistic representations of warfare. And we know from archaeology that wars have existed even a long time before that. So in other words, the issue of war has been with us as long as human beings have been around, and it remains so today. Another proof of that is in the building of the UN you were mentioning, where you can find a copy of a peace treaty between Egypt and the Hittites, where the 2 countries in the Bronze Age, so well over 3,000 years ago, were promising to make peace and never to fight these stupid wars again. And still we are there today trying to discuss how to end war for good. My case here is that, of course, wars are terrible, but they are terrible in the sense of natural disasters, like earthquakes or storms. We may hope to reduce the occurrence of war and to mitigate its violence through a clever statecraft, through good leadership. But making war totally disappear is impossible for as far as the eye can see.
Thank you very much, Dylan. Gabrielle, you get the last word here. Your closing statement, please.
Oh, thank you. Like the last word. We're often told war is inevitable. It's simply part of human nature. But history tells us another story. For 30 years, bombs and bullets dominated life daily in Northern Ireland. Children grew up behind barbed wire. Everybody said reconciliation was impossible. And yet, through dialogue and compromise, the Good Friday Agreement ended the violence, and a new generation grew up in peace. For half a century during the Cold War, two superpowers stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation. The world lived in constant fear that the next day would be the last. Diplomacy, restraint, and the recognition of shared survival pulled humanity back from the edge. South Africa is another example. Apartheid had divided a nation so deep that civil war seemed unavoidable. And yet, Mandela and de Klerk negotiated over bloodshed, reconciliation, and not revenge. A peaceful transition triumphed where war was expected. War is a decision, a failure of politics by other means. And if war is a decision, then so is peace. So let's be clear, war is not inevitable. These are not fairy tale stories. They are choices, and we need to make better choices.
Thank you, Gabrielle. And that concludes our debate on the question, is war inevitable? And I want to thank our debaters, Dylan Motin and Gabrielle Rifkind, for being willing to have the conversation and for the way that you approach this, frankly, with both of you listening to one another and bringing respect to one another and giving us all something to think about. Also, I want to thank the three subject matter experts who joined the conversation as well. My colleagues, I would like to say, Valentina Pop, John Horgan, and Richard Sakwa. And finally, a big thank you to you, our audience, for tuning into this episode of Open to Debate. As a nonprofit that is working to combat extreme polarization through what you just heard, civil debate, our work is made possible by listeners like you, by the Rosencrantz Foundation, and by supporters of Open to Debate. Our chairman is Robert Rosencrantz. Our CEO is Clea Connor. Leah Matthau is our chief content officer. Elizabeth Kitzenberg is our chief advancement officer. And Andrew Lipson is head of production. Michelle Debrasini is head of marketing. This episode was produced by Alexis Pangrazi and Marlet Sandoval. Editorial and research by Gabriella Mayer. Max Fulton and Julia Sirkin provided production support. The Open to Debate team also includes Gabrielle Iannicelli, Eric Gross, Linda Lee, Tom Bunting, and Katy Perry. Damon Whittemore mixed this episode. Our theme music is by Alex Clement. I'm John Donvan. We'll see you next time on Open to Debate.